Can you remember how you started?
Well, I can go right back to how I got a job in the BBC. Is because they came to our school, which I was at Hammersheath Grammar School in Sussex. Anyway, the BBC came, and for some reason I said I'd quite like to be a cameraman, and so they took my details, and I went ahead and took my A levels. I was doing maths and physics at A level. And when I found I'd passed my A-levels, I was very pleased, but then the BBC said, well, if you passed, you can't be a cameraman, you've got to be an engineer, because obviously they didn't have enough engineers, which was a bit of a blow, but as fate would have it, it worked out. So I started my BBC career in 6 months at Wood Norton in Evesham.
Yeah.
And after that, and a brief induction course, where Martin Bell was also involved. I got a place in Radio Links in outside broadcast at Kendall Avenue, Acton. That was okay, but I didn't really want to be an engineer. I liked engineering things, but it wasn't what I wanted to do in my life. But one lunchtime, I saw an advert on the board for trainee assistant film cameramen, an internal board. Now, to start with, I hadn't even thought about film department, and I didn't even know Ealing Studios was owned by the BBC at the time.
But you had wanted to be a cameraman.
Yeah, but I would just thought would be one in the studio.
Oh, yeah.
That's what I thought. I put in for this job, and there were, I think, 800 people who put in for it internally, and 11 of us got it. When there's an external board, there were nearly 2,000 people that put in for these posts. For two reasons. One thing, it's a pretty good job, and secondly, it's the way you can get in and possibly get your ACTT ticket, even though the BBC didn't recognise the ACTT. If you'd done enough, they might give you a ticket, but in fact they did. They gave us tickets.
So the unions there were already, what was it called?
ABS.
ABS.
Well, it technically wasn't a union, but it is now. It's BEC2. It's the same.
BEC2 now.
Yeah.
Sure.
And they sort of all went together with ACT, but ACT were pretty hairy. It's one of the classics. It's a bit like Equity. And you can't join Equity. You can only join Equity if you're an actor, and you can't be an actor unless you join Equity. And it's just ridiculous.
Catch-22. Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
But anyway, so I was very lucky and managed to get an interview. I think there were 3 interviews involved in this job. And I remember the first one, the camera manager said, have you done some filming, and what are your favourite subjects? And I said, well, I specialised in animation. He said, oh, really? He said, and he said, can you describe one of your films? I said, yes. I said, it's a pair of pincers and a big hairy spider, and they have a battle, and then they go out again. He said, oh. He said, how long did that last? I said, about 15 seconds.
Even so.
And then Sidney Budd, who was the appointments officer, said, and I wasn't trying to be funny at all, he said, now, Bill, do you like driving? I said, yes, especially other people's cars. And I meant I didn't have to pay the insurance. He thought I'd like nicking them. So once we got over that, after 3 interviews, I got one of the 11 jobs. And I heard that I got the job while I was on my BBC Grade C Engineers course at Wood Norton. And they wouldn't let me finish it. I had to pack my bags and go, which in hindsight is ridiculous. There was weird animosity between departments, and it's lasted for years. It's so mad. We're all the same company.
Yes, engineers versus operational people. Is that what you
mean? Well, especially studios versus film.
Ah, yes.
I mean, just on a later date, I was filming special effects for a thing called Star Cops at North Acton, where they had their stage. And normally I had to have a generator because they're big lights you have to have for that. But I'd heard there'd just been a 3-phase supply put in by the LDs at the centre. I thought, well, that's good. Didn't have to get a Jenny. I got there, started to hook up, heard a message. If you actually touch that 3-phase supply, all the lighting directors are going to walk out. I thought, why? I mean, it is just mad.
Demarcation.
It is mad, yeah. You're not really taught at dealing. You pick it up. If you're lucky to be with a good cameraman, you pick it up, or and you learn lots of things off sound men and both vice versa, and editors. But that's how you learn. In the engineering, even for operations, it was very much more formal. And I do remember, because the irony was, I went back to Wood Norton to teach lighting many years later, soon after I promoted. And I went with a lovely man from outside broadcast called Alan Walford, who's still alive. He was a top end. He did a lot of ballets and things. And we both agreed we couldn't understand what the lecturers were how they were trying to teach them. Because when the students went into the stage at Wood Norton, or studio, sorry, ours is a stage, they would say, whatever you do, keep all the lights flooded. Don't spot them. Mm-hmm. Now, there's a logic to the fact you get a sharper shadow when you put the barn doors in. But on the other hand, it's not really teaching you lighting. It's not teaching you what you can get away with, what you can do. And I think between Alan and I think we gave the students a bit more of a more open outlook to the rather strict rote by rote.
Because you were practitioners, whereas presumably they're more theoretical the people teaching them.
And we were also practitioners in different disciplines within the lighting era. I mean, there was a case very much later on, because I'm a member of the Society of Television Lighting Directors. Some of us were invited to go to Denmark to a company called Martin Lighting, who make all the big moving lights that you see. But I felt I had to be honest with them, because I said, look, I want you to realise I have never used a moving light. The only time I've been involved with moving lights is when they fall over in the wind. But they still said, come along.
We'll talk about health and safety later.
Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah, so come back to impressions of... I mean, it was if you'd been watching a lot of Ealing Studios comedies as a boy or something like that, it was quite an interesting place to go.
Oh, it was, yes.
So what was there? I mean, there was some standing...
Well, when I first got there, mostly still is, some of it. When I first got there were two main stages. There was stage 2, which was one very large stage, and then there was stage 3A and B, which could be another large stage, but had a massive door that would come down between them. And in the days of Balkan and earlier, that was so well made that they actually sucked the air out, and you could have a big band in one and you would not hear it in the next stage. It was almost like a thermos flask. But that didn't work. We had the other problem of, like, if it rained, you had to write the rain into the script.
Where was stage 1? You say it was 2 and 3.
Stage 1, I think, was a small stage round the corner. It may have been, in the old days, a sort of special effects stage, but very small. And then we had the lot, which was there when I joined, and that's where a lot of Dixon was shot. And that was like a full street. They used the Ealing police station, I think, as the outer. Mm-hmm. And I did actually do some Dixon when I was very young. Yeah. And one of the things that's lovely, compared to Television Centre, you had to walk outside to get to the gents. You got some fresh air. It's not enclosed. I mean, I think Television Centre is an amazing building, but not a place I want to spend my life.
So were you out on the road almost at once?
Yes, yeah. And that is where, unlike the problems I had with the engineering department, where the manager of film was actually wonderful, because soon after I met Kay, my wife, I mean, obviously I was very much in love, and we were in love with each other. And the thought of going away all the time, I got really worried about that. And I almost sort of think, I can't do this. But what the lovely Reg Crawley did, who was the manager, he said, well, look, come in and spend some time in the offices so you understand what's going on. So I worked in FOM's offices, equipment...
Film operation managers.
Film operation managers' offices, yes. That really helped. And also, in almost soon after that, Kay got a job at Ealing, so she knew what I was up to. And she was always very good that way. I mean, unlike some of the people's wives got really worried and hated.
Yes, when they were away.
Not that she liked me being away all the time, but there are advantages. If you compare it to, say, if I had a job in the city. Now, I will be going now, catching an early train, coming back about 7 o'clock. I might be away for 3 weeks, but I can take a week off and see the children or whatever. So it actually worked out quite well. I wasn't the one that took all my overtimes and money. I got quite a lot of leave from it.
Yeah. But tell us about the culture at Ealing. Presumably it was inherited from the film industry rather than from television.
Yes, in fact, some of the people working there when I joined and right through were ex-feature film people. One person, as an example, was Ken Westbury, who was the assistant cameraman on Whiskey Galore. He actually shared digs with a stills photographer called Roy Goff, who's recently had an exhibition at Gunnersbury. So there is a major connection. The way we worked was just the same as feature films. And in fact, I mean, the early days when I first started there, which was great, I got a lot of practice with 35mm black and white. It was loading magazines, eventually operating on them, and also the very complex camera called a Mitchell, which we had some ones dating back to 1936. Really? Still working. And they were still there when I left.
Now they were 35mm cameras.
Yeah.
But you couldn't record sound, presumably synchronously with them.
Yes, you must have been able to do with a synchronizer hub, because you could blimp them. And if you can blimp a camera, it means you can shoot synchronized sound. There would be a way with the synchronizer, a massive thing covering the camera.
A tea cosy over the top of the camera, yeah.
And massive.
Yes.
I mean, if you go back,
the sound,
if you go back to before my days, the days of the Technicolor camera, which had 3 strips of film in it at one time, it was separate black and white negatives. That was quite a big camera. But the blimp, well, you just about get one in the room we're in now.
Really?
They were massive. I've got some pictures of them, but I never did that.
So those were in the days when you recorded colour by having 3 black and white films.
Yes.
With filters, presumably, in front of them.
Yeah, a prism. It was split in a prism, and I remember the green was exposed directly, and the red and blue layers, one was behind the other.
Oh.
Because green's got the most, to the eye, got the most sharpness.
Yes.
Out of it. And of course, if it wasn't for Technicolor in the technology, we wouldn't still be seeing pristine versions of The Wizard of Oz and so many other, nearly all the early Disney cartoons. They can be made at super high definition now, because you can just reprint them separately with no degradation, because black and white doesn't degrade quite so much. You don't get a fading of colour, because you can.
But you do with
with Eastman colour, certainly.
Yes. Well, 16mm, old 16mm looks very washed out, doesn't it? But 35 survives quite well, doesn't it?
Yeah, I don't know whether the washed out bit would be whether somebody's over or underexposing it. Mm. But sometimes the Kodak speed rating was very optimistic, so it's always best to overexpose negative. And if you happen to shoot on reversal film, which we only did for current affairs, you'd underexpose it slightly, otherwise it'd be washed out. But you can overexpose negative film a lot and get a very good print,
really?
But you don't want to underexpose it.
Interesting, yeah. So tell us, if you went out, I mean, you presumably went out initially as an assistant.
A trainee and then an assistant, yes.
Yeah.
The role of assistant cameraman primarily is to change the magazines and focus pull. Focus pulling is quite an art.
Yes.
And in fact, it's easy to appreciate how complex it is once you start operating the camera. You think first, it's a bit of a menial job, but it isn't. And a thing I used to say to very young people who came to work with me, I said, look, you might think you're only loading the mags and doing the rushes, but if you make a mistake, everything's gone. Design, makeup, everything.
Sure.
So it's very important.
But let's just explain that for people who don't know. I mean, you are altering the focal length of the camera. Sorry, the focus, yes, not the focal length.
Yeah.
Focal length is fixed. But the point is that a lot of these shots that you're doing will have relatively shallow depths of field.
It will.
And therefore you have to focus the camera at different points as people move towards you. That's right. And
you do that by measuring with a tape measure in the old days. And you make a note on the side of the camera. It has the bigger ones had a special strip, so you could put everything down. And the art is, because it's not linear. If you went from 60 foot to 40 foot, it's minute, but 40 foot to 6 foot is a big change. So you had to get the timing right, and that was really helped when you started to operate the camera, because you got the feel and the flow. And I think just going back to the difference, that the way we work, it is artistic. It's technical and art mixed together right at the forefront, which is it's pretty exciting and a great way to work.
Yeah. And pulled focuses and things like that. Obviously, you particularly with 4:3 traditional 4:3 aspect ratio as opposed to 16:9. If you look at old Morse films, for example, I know they're ITV, but you see amazing camera work very often.
Oh yeah.
And everything's very tight, but with huge playing with the focus.
Yes, very much so. And that actually was the problem with some of the early video cameras, is they had such small sensors. You had too much depth of field, and you couldn't get that nice feel. Very modern high definition cameras have the images the same size as 35mm, so you get the same lack of depth that you sometimes need to separate the action from what you don't want to see.
Yeah, absolutely. But
no,
you see an awful lot of stuff now which is shot remarkably wide and with most of it in focus, which is rather unsatisfactory.
Well, it can be boring.
Yeah. So, typical day on the road. Would you drive yourself there?
We're talking about as an assistant cameraman. Yes, yeah. I'd normally go with the cameraman, with all the equipment in one car. In the early days, we had Austin A60 estates, Austin Cambridge estates, with a rooftop for putting the camera on, which was then decided later was
for tracking shots. You mean?
Yeah, well, and for getting high shots.
Yeah, getting high shots.
But of course, that was stopped. Health and safety stopped that after a few years. The sound man, with or without an assistant, would have his own car. If we had a grip, he initially would come in a comma van full of equipment, and his job is to lay all the tracking for the camera if we wanted to move the camera smoothly. So yes, we were all in separate cars. If we shoot in London, we would often have a transit type van, because you can't park there, so we had a driver that would stay with the van.
Yeah.
And that I'd rather like that. Not only could you not have a problem of driving there or negotiating yourself, you could have a drink at lunchtime.
Yes, of course. Well, we'll talk about lunch hours. So you went out with, you remember the cameraman you first worked with?
Going right back, one of my early memories is working with a cameraman called Jimmy Court. And I was the trainee on Doctor Who. It's the one that was lost. Fury from the Deep. Fury from the Deep. Now that was lost. And in fact, in the last 2 years, the BBC have remade it as an animated series that you can buy on DVD and Blu-ray. I was on that. I was on the crane. And one of the memories I had was it was a bit like a North Sea oil rig set. And the idea was that this sea monster will come bursting out of this tube, rampage through the lab, and smash his way through the door, and then go out. And that was the cut. This was 16mm black and white with Patrick Troughton. Anyway, on the first take, we're on the crane, and the special effects man dressed up as the monster does everything, rampages, gets to the door, and the carpenters have put their hinges a long way round. So he suddenly stops rampaging and politely opens the door and walks out. They had to reshoot that. That was brilliant.
That's very funny.
And it just show you how culty this has become. Early this year, I was asked to go and give a very short talk on special effects at the National Film Theatre, because they were doing, they were showing the Sylvester McCoy series, which I did all the film effects for. Not all the effects, but all the film effects. So, okay, can you give a quick talk? And I gave a quick talk to very much a Doctor Who audience. And I was asked by the interviewer, said, did you ever work on anything else? I said, well, only as a trainee, and this strange thing called Fury from the Deep. And there was this, round the around there, because there was a human being that had worked on this lost episode. So
Yeah,
it is very
yes.
culty.
You always hope that some far part of the empire's got an old black and white tele-recording that maybe survived.
Well, yes, I'm sure they've been looking for it
Yeah.
because making the animation is expensive.
Yeah, absolutely.
But on that animation, as extras, there is Tony Cornell, who was a designer, and he was based at Ealing Studios. He did all the film stuff. He shot a lot of 8mm on the set, and that's on the DVD, and all the trims that the editor had thrown away. And so there's shots of me putting the board on. I haven't got my head in, but I know it's me because I'm left-handed and my watch is on my right hand. And I remember the shirt.
But they can't put much together from the trim,
No,
the
no,
trims,
but it's good for me. Good ego trip.
Now, tell us about lighting in those days, because the cameras were relatively insensitive.
Well, some were, some weren't. Well, when we were shooting, let's say for instance, Softly Softly, a police series with Stratford Johns, we often shot at night on what was called 4X stock. Now that was 400 ASA. That's quite fast for those days. You couldn't shoot that on 16mm, it'd be too grainy, but on 35mm it was really good. So the actual ability to light quite long distances wasn't too bad. We still use obviously lots of 10Ks and brute arc lights, which are pretty massive. But in colour, once colour came in, it was almost like going back to Technicolor, because Technicolor I think was equivalent of about 10 ASA. That's why people almost melted in the studios.
Really? Yes.
Banks of arc lights.
Yes, yes.
And the first Eastman colour we used was 50 ASA, and means 32 ASA to daylight when you put an orange filter on, because we always used colour film that was balanced for internal tungsten light, as you would use then in the studio, because it was more efficient. Because if you put a filter on a tungsten film to turn, so it thinks daylight is tungsten, so you get the right white balance.
Yes.
You only lose 2/3 of the stop. If you've got a daylight film and you're filming in the studio and you put a deep blue filter on to make it think it's daylight, you lose nearly 2 stops. So it wasn't practical.
Okay.
That's why we always use tungsten stock.
But nearly always you were filming not for documentaries necessarily, you were filming for film inserts, studio programs.
Very much so.
Right, so there the lighting was rather critical.
Yeah.
Presumably you could tweak telecine to some extent.
You could tweak telecine, and also you could tweak it in the laboratories. I mean, that's where it first started.
Yeah.
That's when I'm going back to what I said earlier about giving a full exposure on the negative, because the labs can print that slightly bright leg down and you get a beautiful black. You don't get mud. I mean, what happens is you shoot the film, the laboratories provide an overnight print called a Rush's print, which the film operations manager and producer, whoever, watches to check they've got what they need. And then when the editors put it all together, he gets a show print made, which is all graded to be ideal. And then that goes to telecine. So it's normally only rush jobs that are heavily tweaked in telecine, which, if you remember, was called Tariff.
Yes. Tom's apparatus for the rectification.
Tony's apparatus.
Oh, all right.
It's Tony's apparatus.
Well, in the studios they were Tom's.
Was
it? Technical operations manager.
Oh yes,
so
I
Tom's
was
apparatus for the rectification of indifferent film.
That's right. Yes.
But presumably, sometimes you would get an attachment, or would you to a crew that was doing a documentary. So you'd have some continuity in the shooting of, from week to week, possibly.
Yeah, there were things like were called block crews, where you spend months on panorama or whatever.
Exactly.
And some documentaries, yes. I mean, I've done a lot of documentaries. It wasn't my favourite thing.
You preferred drama, did you?
Well, drama and the best thing, I loved light entertainment and variety and comedy.
What were your favourites? Tell us some.
Well, when I started as an assistant, I was assistant on the Phantom Raspberry Blower of Old London Town, with the 2 Ronnies written by Spike Milligan. Now that's still so notable.
Yes.
And I worked. There was a case. Just going on that, a very famous bit when we were doing a night shoot in Highgate Cemetery, We had to have 2 generators, one for the filming and one to light the paths, because people were so scared in there. And there were bodies hanging out of coffins because there was a lot of necrophilia going on at the time, which was a strange
Good Lord.
fetish.
Absolutely.
But anyway,
yeah.
so we were doing that, and the sequence was a coffin comes up, puts in the ground, and then a stake goes through the coffin, and all this raspberry juice comes out because it's found a raspberry below, you see. Well, that caused mayhem with the Highgate lady who ran it. She banned us for years. Anyway, so, well, it was fun.
Oh, wonderful.
But then
Now-
again, then as a cameraman, I went on to shoot the 2 runners, partly because of all the people. And, of course, the other thing I didn't...
Were they good fun on location?
Oh, yeah. They're quite serious. I mean, the first time I was told, I was aware of it, that Ronnie Barker liked to look through the camera, which I never minded, some people did. And he actually came up and he said to me on the first day, "Do you mind if I look through the camera now and again?" I said, "Not at all, Ronnie, as long as you don't mind me writing some jokes." Which didn't go down that well, but it worked. It worked. We got on well. I got on very well with Ronnie Corbett.
Yeah.
Very, very, very nice. I was very impressed by him. People always think he's like the side issue, but he wasn't. He was a damn good actor.
Yes.
And he did a lot.
Now, what sort of cameras were you using in those early days?
The early days, there were mainly Arriflex.
Oh, right.
They were the very early days were called an ST Arri. That was basically a silent Arri. And if you were shooting synchronised sound, you put them in one of these big metal blimps to quieten it. And they were very quiet that way. But the viewfinders weren't very good. No, they were not great.
Yeah. I mean, when I first went out with crews, it was the Arriflex, and they were blimped. So you could use them, and you recorded sound usually with an umbilical.
That's right. Yeah.
Cable between you and the sound man, between the camera and the sound.
There was a very strange coincidence. It was going back to when I had my interview to get the job. I was asked if I knew the names of any film cameras, professional cameras. I saw an Arriflex BL in Dixon's contract hire window in Oxford Street half an hour before I went into the board. I thought, a BL, oh, I remember that. When I first got in, say in '67, I moved to film, the BL had just come in. Now, the Arriflex BL is still a noisy camera, but it's like, it's a tiny blimp. You can put it on your shoulder. It wasn't that heavy, but it's quite a quietened camera. The Eclair MPR and later the Arton, which is both French cameras, which is the Artons are the one I used most of the time, they were quiet cameras. They weren't blimp, they were quiet. And when they were set up beautifully, they were a bit more quirky than the Arri. You could throw around a bit more. You had to be a bit kinder to the French ones, but they were lovely cameras, and they had a big viewfinder.
Now, presumably there were lighting cameramen, and then there were just ordinary cameramen. Is that right?
No. A film cameraman is a lighting cameraman.
A lighting cameraman.
The name is now director of photography, and that was partly brought in because it's sexless, and it's much nicer than saying film camera woman. And it's just DOP.
Yes.
These days, lighting cameraman is often referred to people who go out on sort of jobs with a video camera, but not using a lot of lighting. A director of photography is somebody who would use generators, not all the time, but would have the experience of using a lot of electricians and a lot of power. Yeah. And that's one of the reasons I love comedy, because it had bigger budgets than drama, often.
Yes. How long did it take you to become from being an assistant to being a fully fledged cameraman?
Well, I became a full assistant.
Operator.
I became a full assistant in 1968 after being a trainee, and I became a cameraman in 1981. Now, that was about 13 years.
That's a long time, yeah.
Some of my colleagues made it in 5 years, but they were happy to do very dangerous things and liked doing documentaries, which I much preferred to go the other route. I stayed as an assistant, but I became a competent camera operator and filmed on a lot of big stuff. Now, that helps you if you want to be a proper director of photography.
Yeah. So if you were out with a crew and you had a cameraman when you were an assistant,
yeah,
and he trusted you,
Yes.
he would give you the chance to operate, and so
Absolutely.
you could operate you could do quite a lot of operation, presumably, before you became a proper fully fledged
Very
cameraman.
much so.
Yeah,
Yes.
right.
Yeah,
Okay.
and then you will also have a period of acting as a cameraman, like
Right.
there's in most areas of the BBC you can act up. It's a cheap way of doing
way of
things,
filling it.
but it's good
Yeah.
you experience.
But would this always be? Presumably, the director would always be asked.
Oh yeah.
It wasn't a matter of the cameraman could decide that you could operate. You would
A
always
little
have to
bit
get
that way,
permission.
but I mean it's polite. I mean I'll give you an example of when I shot all of Keeping Up Appearances in the 90s, everything.
Yeah.
The first series I shot it myself, but I had a really good assistant cameraman who was a good operator called Chris Kakanowitz, and I said to Harold Snow, the producer, look, I think it could work well if Chris shot and I did the lighting, because there was a lot of lighting to do.
Yeah.
And he was very unsure, but after day one, he wouldn't go back because everything was so much more efficient. I could go on and light another location and leave him with Chris. But the big important thing, the way a cameraman and operator work together, is the fact that the operator has to be aware of the limits of what you can light. Other words, he could say to the director, "Oh, it's a great shot." Then the cameraman said, "No, I can't light that." So you work together, but it can be a very efficient way of doing things. And then on the odd occasion, if there are two cameras, well, I'd pick up the camera and do the second camera. Now, some of my colleagues, understandably, never let their assistant operate because they didn't like anybody to go between them and the director. But in some ways, I never agreed with that, because if I could produce good results with an operator more efficiently, it still rubs off on me and I will still get good jobs that way. And also, my assistant is so much more involved. And I always used to try and get as many people involved in the production. Like, there's nothing worse than being an electrician stuck in the corner waiting to be told what light to move. If you get them involved, and like if I was doing a second camera on Keeping Up Appearances, I'd ask one of the electricians if they would be happy to do a quick focus ball. It just means that you become a family,
Yeah.
and that's important.
Yeah. Now, tell me about how you'd light a set. What would you have the typical sort of? Presumably, you're going to have a number of positions, and they're all going to do the scene from one side and then the scene from the other side. Do you light for both camera positions, or do you light for one camera position and then relight for another?
Well,
what do you do?
Some people used to do that. Some of the old film days, it was said that you lit every shot. I never did that. If I could give you an example of the biggest thing I ever lit, because it is a good example, it was soon after I was promoted. I got onto the Two Ronnies in 1983, and one of the things I had to light on this large stage 2 was a medieval village. Daytime medieval village.
Yeah.
Now, I hadn't done anything or like this before. I'd not been with a cameraman who'd done it, and the camera manager was quite worried because he came up and said, "Are you sure you can cope with this?"
Yeah.
Which of course I said I would. But basically, I went to basics. I didn't sort of worry about who else had done what. I put a bank of HMI daylight lights up, about 3, as the sun. But the trick is, you make sure the beams never overlap, because you never want to have more than one shadow.
Yes.
Not on planet Earth. If you're some other planet, you're all right. But on planet Earth, there's one shadow. Now, that isn't that difficult, because you've got houses in the way. You can stop it. So there's the sun. So I thought, I need some clouds. So I put some things called space lights, with massive soft lights hanging from the ceiling. They're the clouds. I lit the cyc, which is the background painting for the back. And basically, I then went round with a little battery lamp, as if it was a real village. And it worked, and you get continuity that way. And in fact, after the camera manager being worried about it, after the shoot, he said there was a drama producer was wondering where the location was. And he said everybody thought it was great. So I was really lucky. It was good, because you don't want to muck up the Two Ronnies.
No, absolutely.
And I got invited the next year, so I must have been all right.
Were they good on retakes? And tell us about
What, Ronnie's?
The actual business of filming a scene for a comedy.
Well, it will be quite normal to maybe do a quick rehearsal, but you don't want to do too many, especially if there's jokes involved. Sometimes you'd rehearse on film, in other words, you do a take, but you're lucky if it worked. Depending on what you were filming on. If you're on 16, it wasn't too expensive, so you could...
You could record the rehearsal.
You could.
Just in case it was
Not
really...
You do it an awful lot more on video because it's dirt cheap.
Yes, quite.
But on film, 400 foot of film, I think it was about...
100 quid, wasn't it?
Plus all the processing. So
yes.
it was a fair amount of money, but relative to the salaries of the design, art and the leading artists, it's a bit like them. Like if you look at the new Bond film, that was shot in 65mm film. Now, when you look at everybody involved with that, it might be expensive, but it was peanuts compared to the rest of the budget. And you've got something that's going to be there for 100 years in super high definition. So,
let's just stop there just to ask you about modern filming. You still shoot on film, do you, for some reason, rather than electronic cameras?
Yeah, people do both. The difference is that you shoot on film, but you never edit on film. It will go immediately to very high level digital electronic format, which is you're then processed and edited. But one of the reasons people will still record on film is that you have an archivable product. If you shoot electronically, there's still no guarantee you'll be able to see that in 30 years' time. But a film, you quite likely will. You know, somebody better make the mechanics to do it, to run a film.
But if you were filming in the 70s or 80s or something like that, you shoot the thing, you've no idea whether it worked or not. Because particularly if your assistant is operating, you've no idea about what the framing was like, whether the camera moves were exactly right.
No. There's trust involved in that, whether you're the cameraman or operating or the operator operating and the director. But again, unlike some of my colleagues, I was always very happy if somebody wanted to use an electronic viewfinder. And we did have electronic viewfinders on film cameras. The art on was quite unique, is that you could put a radio, you could transmit from the camera. And somewhere I got a wonderful shot of Ronnie Barker, Marcus Plantin, the producer, with a little monitor stuck up his jumper, looking down with Ronnie Barker looking over his shoulder. But I don't know where it is. I've got it somewhere. But no, I never minded that. Some people do.
Video assist. It was
I mean, I've never thought the image. I'm responsible for the image as regards the photography is concerned. But other people have a responsibility for that image. The designer, makeup, and costume. Everybody's got involved. The actors are responsible. So I think it was wrong. Say, oh no, that's mine. You can't have that. I just thought it was blatantly wrong.
Yeah. How do you learn to frame shots? There used to be, technical books on how to direct, which tell you, always keep the eyes between 2/3 and 3/4 of the way up the screen.
Yeah.
Put the central thing of interest on the crossing of thirds, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Now, does that still apply, or do people break the rules all the time?
Well, you
or
do.
Crossing the line, of course.
You do both, yeah. I think it boils down to a certain amount of talent, natural talent people have. I think people are good at playing the piano. The irony was, I can't draw. I've had one painting put up in my junior school, and that was it. But I earned my money in pictures. But the fact I can't draw doesn't mean I'm not aware of feel. One of my favourite cameramen I worked for, a lovely man called Peter Hall, he always used to say in the early days, as a little exercise, you get a piece of paper, you put a dot on it, then you balance that dot with another dot, and you just keep doing it, balancing, which was a very good idea. It is something built into you. You know something's not right, or it's not right, but it works. An example of doing it wrong is the old thing about if somebody's breaking a door in, and you've got somebody inside there trying to get at. Now, normally you keep the camera on the same side of the action, so the left to right and right to correct. But if you go the wrong side, it gives the audience a shock, just to that one bit, and it can work. And it's always, rules are great, but you need to know the rules so you can break them.
Yes.
I think it works in any discipline.
Right. Tell us about working. You worked, I think, on Blackadder.
Yes, in 1983.
Tell us about that, because that's a fascinating series. Well, series of series.
Yes.
You worked on the first one, did you?
Oh, well, on the first one was the only one that really had any filming, and it had a lot of film.
Yes.
Now, of course, you put on Blackadder with along with the director and everybody else. We didn't know what it was and what it was going to be like. It was an unknown quantity, and Rowan Atkinson wasn't sure what it was going to be like. You know, he had an idea, but it was quite something. In hindsight, we've gone, but all the filming was shot up in Northumberland in Alnwick, on Alnwick Castle, and if you manage to see any of the sequences outside and it's snowing, it's no special effects. It was so cold. The local wall was ran out of boot inserts. It was bitterly cold for everybody. I mean, I pitied some of the actors who they weren't, couldn't wear as much as we did. But it was an amazing thing to do. I mean, it was a lot of night shoots. In fact, I didn't have a lot of lights on that. I mean, there were 2.5 kilowatt HMI lights, which these days are peanuts, but they'd only just come out. And I was able to use those, but the fact we were able to do that with film stock that wasn't that fast, I mean, originally it did look a bit on the grainy side. It's been cleaned up very well lately, but it was amazing. I mean, I remember there was a sequence where we were doing a sort of Macbeth sequence, the Three Witches of Endor, and in the script it said the witches were red, green and blue. And I presumed it'd be makeup, but makeup didn't do that. So I thought, well, I'd do it. So I lit them with 3 lamps, red, green and blue. That's everything, but didn't do anything else. And so we shot it, and when I phoned up for the rushes report in the morning, I asked John, the operations manager, I said, what did that look like? He said it was like looking at a 3D movie without the glasses. I said, just right. Of course, where it blends together, you do get natural light.
Yeah. Did you work on Blackadder later?
No.
When it's tightened up?
No, he changed from what I would call a comedy drama to a sitcom. A completely different thing. That's why some people hate the first series or love it and don't like the other so much.
Right.
I mean, I think they're all quite good. There's one in the middle I didn't like too much. But working with people like Brian Blessed and Peter Cook, Elspeth Gray, it was just great.
Yes.
I mean, I never forget Brian Blessed doing a sermon in a pulpit in this convent we were using to film. It was frightening. He was smashing his pulpit around, gosh, with a big sword, and it was so powerful. And also in that play, to show you when you get good, true team effort, is that I was inside with my gaffer lighting the convent. Outside, we both noticed that the electricians from Lee North, which was the contracting company that we were using, very nice people, they had to put a ladder up to the big window in the back of shop and were colouring it with gel. We didn't ask them, but they did it because they had a feeling that's what would look good. And that I was never forget.
Is there anything you want to say about camera settings, looks, the look? I mean, individual camera operators have a different look, or directors want a particular
I would say it'll be the director may want a specific look, and it's up to us to sort of provide it in lots of ways. On film, you can use filters, obviously, on location. Be a bit careful with them, especially soft focus ones. But they can be very good. But of course, a lot of the look is derived from the laboratories and the grader, like that.
But now it's settings inside the electronic cameras.
Well, yes, but the safest thing to do, and I think you'll find most main feature films will do very little on location. They will do
Leave
it later.
To the grading.
And in fact, what I often did on documentaries, with the approval of the editor, is that I would set the colour balance halfway, so it was a bit cool, but neither right nor wrong. Which means they could just tweak it. So if there was a difference in the weather, it's easy for them to tweak across grades. So there are looks. I mean, one of the most famous looks I was asked to give was by Paul Jackson for the Jasper Carrot show. and I had to film a very bad B-movie trailer called The Hands of Dr. Madness, with Robbie Coltrane playing Dr. Madness and Chris Ryan, the famous pianist. Well, the story goes that the pianist loses his hands in a rail accident, which we used an arrow gauge train and shot at 75. It was one of the most enjoyable things I've done. All shot in black and white and made it look quite grainy.
Yeah.
I'd set up this track on the Ealing stage, and I didn't put track down. I did it across the floorboard, so it's like this. Bruce said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, it's supposed to look bad." "Oh, all right." So we did all this. And there was a sequence I remember when I'd forgot I was shooting in black and white, because we had this mad scientist laboratory and all the little dinky lights lighting the bottles. And I said to John Barrett, my gaffer, I said, "Oh, can you put a pale straw in that? 'Cause it's supposed to be an oil lamp." He said, "Okay." And he came back and said, "We're in black and white." Oh, yes, so we are. So we didn't have to do it.
What about overseas trips? Did you do any of those?
Oh, a lot, yeah.
Ah.
Yeah.
Doing what sort of things?
Well, amazing amount. To begin with, as a young assistant, I was on Barlow at Lars, which is an offshoot of Softly Softly. And I did 3 of those in Amsterdam, Gibraltar and Orvieto in Italy.
Mm-hmm.
So that was quite a big deal, got good experience. And I remember when we went to Italy, Peter Hamilton, who was the DOP, we had a Colin Munn was his operator for a while, and it changed to a man called Colin Dean, who was a perfectly good operator. But Peter told me, "You won't have any trouble with Colin. I know exactly what to tell you, where to put the camera, exactly what lens to put on." I said, "Okay." So we had one of the big blimp cameras with us, because Peter liked using those because it made people shut up. It looked big. Well, that was pretty heavy to cart around, but I did agree with him a bit. But you also had a smaller Arriflex BL. Now that was fine, I didn't mind that, but you should never leave a camera laced with film in the gate, because it can erode the gate. So I'd always leave the loop outside the camera. And of course the inevitable happened. Colin, the operator, used the BL on a shot, and I hadn't put it through the gate. Mm-hmm. So I quickly went up to Peter, the cameraman, and said, "I'm terribly sorry, that wasn't laced." He said, "Oh, don't worry, dear boy, we'll sort that out." I said, "Oh, don't worry, I've already put it down as underexposed." he did have a sense of humour.
Yeah.
There was a period when I was with Peter Hall that we went to Monte Carlo twice, which is pretty rare. We went to Monte Carlo when we were shooting Rebecca with Jeremy Brett and Joanna David. And then we were working on Magic of the Dance in Margot Fontein. We did quite a lot on that. And the 2 main things I remember was filming in the Kilburn Empire with Rudolf Nureyev. Now, Paddy Foy, who was the producer, she could be annoying sometimes. Like, she stopped a shot on the Ealing stage with Mikhail Baryshnikov because she saw some big line on her monitor. And actually what it was a graticule on the viewfinder. And when we had coffee break, there was the music director, Paddy, and Rudolf Nureyev talking. And I, being me, went up to the music director and said, "Do you know what the Italian for writing music quickly is?" He said, "No." I said, "It's allegro con biro, you see." Now, I then left, but I noticed that Nureyev then said to me, "What is this con biro?" And he had to explain this. Awful joke.
Yes, terrible joke.
And then when we went to Monte Carlo, to the Monte Carlo Opera House, 2 things happened there. So I went down to get some new film from the car, and I went down. They had 2 lifts. Went down the lift and got the film. Got back in the lift. It's a different lift, and it was a bit plusher. Had a chandelier in it. And I went up, and I was met at the top by the security guard. Said, "Monsieur, c'est seulement pour le roi." I said, "All right then, I won't do that again." And then when I was up in the balcony, I took a photo of Margot as the doll from Petrushka on my new 110 reflex camera. And then when I had it processed, I was working with her again, and she signed it for me. So I've got a picture signed by Margot Fonteyn, which is quite a treasured thing to have.
You've a particular interest in music, haven't you?
Yes.
So did you look for opportunities to work on programs that were about music?
To a degree. One of the biggest ones was in 1979 or 8, where I was one of the number 2 camera out of 4 or 5 in the Music Verein in Vienna, filming the Vienna Philharmonic with Strauss's Alpine Symphony, with a lovely director called Ian Engelman. Now, this is where fate comes in. The story goes on. I was working with a lighting cameraman called Gene Carr, who you might remember, and he was doing the shot and shoot, and he said to me, "Would you like to do number 2 camera?" But when Ian heard that I was doing it, he was a bit worried because I hadn't got specific experience in filming orchestras. And I thought, well, I was working on some awful panorama program about the Tolpuddle Martyrs, and I came back and I was just browned off, and I said, well, if I don't want to go unless I can actually film it. So I had the opportunity to phone the producer, so I quickly bought an LP of the Alpine Symphony, read the sleeve notes at the back, and then bullshitted my way. As it was in those days, because I hadn't got a lot of experience, he said, well, look, you can come, but I think you'd better come out on all the recces as well to get used to it. So I was out in Vienna for over 2 weeks, listening to the music, and there was a lovely point when Gene Carr and I were sitting in a balcony in the Music Verein, listening to the Alpine Symphony, which is a 120-piece orchestra. And I whispered to Gene, I said, that was bloody loud. And Gene said, that's rubbish, beautiful music, all this stuff, you see. So when it finished, we come off the stage, walk down, and Andre Previn comes off. He said, Christ, that was bloody loud. So that was quite fun, but that was good. That was really good fun. If I can just go back a little bit, because there was another big story, is that when I was working with a cameraman called John Turner, we were doing Jim Fix-It, and it was a young boy who wanted to fly with the Red Arrows. And when we were actually at the place where he was going to take off, for some reason I can't remember, John didn't want to go up, so I did. And I took a small camera called a Canon Scoop. It was a 100-foot load electric film camera. That seemed to be okay. Got 10 minutes training in being the back of a gnat, which is, I don't think it'd be legal now. So I had the helmet on, the flying suit, and the camera. Well, when you take off, you can't move the camera. The G-forces, you just cannot move it. When we levelled out, I was able to pick it up to my eye and found I couldn't look in the viewfinder because of the helmet. So I had to stick my finger over the viewfinder to stop any light coming in back, held it above me, and hopefully I was doing a shot of the little boy. And when I'd done enough, I tried zooming in, blind, and that did work, but it was nobody was more surprised than me. But while we were flying, I'd gone through 100 foot of film, and I said to the pilot, I'm just going to change roles, change spools. Yeah, okay, he said. So I was in the middle of doing it, and the take-up spool fell out of the camera into the works of the plane. So I said to the Red Arrows pilot, look, I'm terribly sorry, it's fallen down somewhere, and I don't know where it is. I was a bit worried about it getting in the works. He said, don't worry, old boy, we'll try a bit of negative G, see if we can shift it. So we shot up in the air, rocketed down. No, it didn't move it. So we ended up landing. We got what we needed. And 2 weeks later, I met the producer at Television Centre Club, and he presented me with a watercolour, which after 47 years, I've just framed, of a sad-looking Gnat aircraft with a camera on its wing, saying, we don't think Jim fixed it. And it was painted by an RAF officer called Bruce Rigglesford, which at the time, he was the only artist officer in the RAF. And you can look him up. So that was an amazing one-off. But you can't plan these things.
No. You didn't try flying upside down then?
No.
That might have dislodged it.
The strange thing was I did feel quite queasy down, but it wasn't the G-force, it was the stink of kerosene.
Really?
Gets in the helmet. That's horrible.
Yeah. Helicopters? Did you
I did.
Film from them?
When I was a trainee, I was put on the bird's eye view of Britain's stately homes. And that that was a great job because there were two crews. There was a ground crew and an air crew. And as a trainee, I was given a Morris 1100 with a load of stock, and I had to service both crews. So basically, nobody knew where I was. One crew thought I must be with the other crew. But I was quite good. I did do my job. But there were opportunities there when, it was, talk about an ego trip. I was only about 21, 22, and this big crowd of people in Bath, because they knew this helicopter was going to land. And the cameraman got out with the producer, and the cameraman wanted to borrow the car. He says, "You're in the helicopter." So I was pulled out the crowd, put in this helicopter, and flew off to the Midlands, which I actually shot on 8mm. I've still got that. Yeah. But that was quite a show. One of the things I remember was, we were filming Berkeley Castle, a hunt at Berkeley Castle, and when we landed, the Lady Berkeley's butler invited us in for sherry and coffee. So fine. So we went in, and Lady Berkeley said hello, and she said, "I must show you my new colour television." So I said, oh yeah, okay. There were 11 of us, including all the production crew and pilots and things. So she turned it on. Of course, being BBC, we said, well, that's not bad, but that shouldn't be like that. The colour isn't quite right, you know. She said, really? And she got on the phone to the dealer and said, "Hello, I have 11 gentlemen from the BBC here saying the colour television you sold me is not all it should be." So I felt very sorry for him.
Yes, quite. You got a favourite, really, looking back? I mean, either the most hair-raising or the most entertaining or the most charming bit of work that you did?
Well,
so many.
I still have a very fond memory from doing series 2 of The Young Ones, because that was something. Well, it was mad. I only did the film. Obviously, there was OB Studios and film in it, but it was just mad. And I was the cameraman responsible for shooting the bus going over a cliff at the end of the last episode of series 2. Now that was interesting because it was a real bus, a real route master, and we were in it. The stuntman was driving it. Really? We were inside, and I did all the shots of the young ones talking about going on a summer holiday, because it was a spoof on Cliff Richard's Summer Holiday. And then in the sequence, one of them says, "Look out, Cliff," and of course Cliff was a big poster of Cliff Richard. And the bus goes through it and crashes down a cliff, a real cliff. Now, on that sequence, we had 5 cameras, I think.
It's difficult to retake it.
Yeah, it was a bit. But anyway, the bus fell over the cliff. Obviously, the stuntman jumped out at the last minute. I mean, wow. He toppled a bit, landed upright, and it wasn't in bad nick, really.
Really?
No. So we had a huddle because between Paul Jackson and the special effects and everybody thinking, the idea was to kill them off because it's the last episode, you see. So, well, how are we going to kill them off? So I think we thought, let's blow it up. So special effects guys got all the stuff ready, and boy, did it go. And it burnt for ages because of the aluminium in it.
Yes.
And then there was the end credits. Now, this is a good thing. This is where Paul Jackson was a nice maverick, because he got the permission from everybody, actors, everybody, technicians, to have a credit saying these were the young ones, just in alphabetical order. It didn't matter what you did in it, and that actually went out. But boy, did he get bollocked by the management, because you should have a separate.
He credited everybody.
Yeah, but it was lovely because it was almost like it was a very big family. Yes. And of course that programme was the first.
That was Rick Malenko, wasn't it?
Yeah, and Aid Edmondson.
Yes.
Yeah. That was the first programme ever to win a BAFTA in LE. And funny enough, Blackadder, the Archbishop, was the first one ever to win an Emmy in New York. So
really?
I didn't, not personal, but it's nice to be associated with firsts.
Absolutely,
in that sense.
Yeah. Now, if I have a personal, real gripe with BBC, well, it's not just the BBC now, because whenever a programme ends, you find the credits either disappear into a tiny little corner or they get squashed sideways.
Yes, absolutely.
And that is insulting.
It is insulting. It is also, people just think credits are an ego trip. They're not. They're a way to further work. It's like anything else. They're important. And I agree. I mean, sometimes if I'm recording a feature film, apart from taking any adverts out, I take that bit out when they do talk over it. So I miss some credits, but at least it's not annoying when I watch it again.
Yes, all the voiceovers and everything else is
Oh,
really annoying, yeah.
Yes.
Now tell us
Horrible.
about the move to electronic cameras.
Well, that was twofold. Obviously, there was some resistance from Television Centre, but the overall deal was that they would have what they will call PSC, or portable single camera crews, that will come out mainly from the studios, a little bit from OBs, and we would then start filming in video, on video. And during that time, I had a personal issue video and a film camera, because you wouldn't know what you were going to do depending on what the production wanted. And it worked out all right in the end. Most of the time we were used in electronic cameras if it's slightly more complex, especially if it was a dramatic lighting and things like that, because a lot of the crews at the centre, it was a totally different discipline. I mean, I couldn't go and do what they do, running around with pods. It would take me a long while to do it, even if I wanted to do it. But equally, they weren't experienced in lighting. So I think they would do the simpler stuff, which like one-man kit lighting, which they could pick up fairly reasonably. And I think we did often some of the more complex stuff on video.
But the early video cameras were pretty unpleasant, weren't
They were atrocious.
There's black edges around things.
Yeah, well, I mean, there was one that was so embarrassing. I did a job with a man called Jonathan Fulford, and it was covering Gilbert Kaplan, who was the head of Forbes magazine. Now, what he does with his pocket money is hires orchestras to play Mahler's Second. And he hired the LSO and St David's Hall to conduct Mahler's Second, and he was good at it. I like his recording more than Simon Rattle.
Really?
I think it's wonderful. But we were filming that on early tube Betacams, not CCD solid state ones. And they were very insensitive to start with. So heavy, you couldn't handhold it for long. We called them lead parrots. They really were very heavy. And the other problem is, when you're used to a film camera, you know the film camera's running because you get a flicker. You don't get it on a video camera. And more often than not, you'd record something you weren't, and then you'd record when you weren't recording. It wasn't technically good. We got the shots. Yes. But, I mean, I think Jonathan realised that this was early days, and it wasn't that great.
They slowly got very much better.
Yeah.
Well, very quickly got very much better. In fact, you went to work for Sony, didn't you, after you worked at the BBC?
Afterwards, yes, yes.
To presumably advise them about getting the best out of their new cameras.
Yes, I mean, basically, my job role was called production advisor, and my unofficial job role is to talk techie to lovies, which was lovely. Yes. And fortunately, the man who hired me said, whatever you do, don't become a Sony person. I didn't mean that against Sony, but he just wanted to be somebody a little bit out of the box. Yes. Which was great, because if I did things he didn't like, I'd say, well, you told me not to be a Sony person.
But being a BBC person, as it were, but not working for the BBC was presumably a great advantage. Very
useful, especially like if I remember going to see clients at BBC White City who were doing the holiday programme. Mm-hmm. Now, they had two programmes, one on ITV, I can't remember, one was called Holiday Programme, one was called Getaway, I can't remember, some other programme. And I went to see both of them, and they both wanted individual looks, slightly sunny, you know. So we would go through all the things, you know, all the different adjustments on the camera, and they would write down, yeah, that's it. And they both happened to choose exactly the same thing, but we wouldn't tell each other. But the lovely thing about going to White City was soon after I'd left the BBC. So I had my first ever company car with Sony. I've never had that in my life before. Expensive though. So I was able to drive into White City car park with my BBC pass, park there, flip it to my Sony pass, see the client, flip it back and come out. Which was rather good. Couldn't do that for very long.
Yeah. Also, I mean, there must have been times when you had problems, for example, with film stock not being up to the quality it should have been, and so on, and having to reshoot things. And
extremely rare.
Yes.
It was amazing. I can hardly remember one where we had to reshoot due to the film stock. There was one, and it was when I was shooting special effects on 35mm, because the rated exposure for the film I was given was so optimistic that I had to reshoot some at about twice the exposure. But I don't totally take the blame for that. It was completely wrongly categorised, but that is rare. Most of the time, it was very reliable. Colour film in some ways you could muck around with it more, because colour film had what's called an anti-halation backing. It was a very dark black back. And one of the side effects is that if you dropped the film, you didn't get any static build-up. Black and white, if you dropped a black and white film, you could get like lightning going through the images.
Really?
Yeah, you had to be more careful with that. So you could, in the early days, have problems with that.
What about hairs in the gate and all that sort of
Oh,
thing?
hairs in the gate. If you were a good assistant, you'd be checking. And so you'd shoot again on location, which is not quite the same. What you don't want to happen is have to find out the next day.
No, quite.
And I can give you a good example of that. Is one of the first jobs I did with Peter Hall, which was mind-blowing, was flying to Bahrain with Shirley Bassey to do the film sequences for the Shirley Bassey Christmas show in 1975. We were booked to go to have a private Concorde to film on and fly there, but that fell through at the last minute. And in some ways, you might, fortunately, although not many people say that, the producer was Stuart Morris. And he phoned up Lord King, I think at the time, and said, look, I've got the crew, I've got Bassey, I've got the band, I've got the studio, you can't do this. So Lord King gave us a private VC-10 for 5 days, and we flew out to Bahrain.
But you'd hoped it was going to be Concorde.
Ah, yeah, we did film the Concorde, but only on the ground at Filton. So we got the sequence. But there was that was just. I mean, I remember being in the lavatory washroom area in the plane, thinking, this is bizarre jet setting. I mean, is this? You just don't expect this. And there was an evening when we in this hotel. We stayed in the Bahrain Hilton. When we got there, it was found the rate for the Bahrain Hilton was so high that nobody could really afford. Even in actuality, it was over the top then. So Marcus Plantin, who was Stuart's production assistant, who was subsequently the producer I worked with on the Ronnies, he went to see the manager of the Bahrain Hilton that had just been built and told him, well, look, these things you can't do. You can't give 24-hour breakfast. You can't do this. You can't do that. And he got it down to £6 a night. Now, this was the 70s, but even though that was pretty good. We were so impressed, we let Marcus tell everybody individually that he'd done this. So we ensconced ourselves in there. Well, we didn't see it much because we were shooting for 15-hour days. But I was in the bar, and although my normal mode of dress is shorts and a T-shirt, which is one of the other nice things about not working in a bank, I was actually in a jacket and quite a, almost like a suit. Very rare for me. In the bar, getting drunk with the other members of the thing. The co-pilot rushed in and said, I've got to get a message to the pilot. And everybody else was very casually dressed. And the pilot was in with the camera and sound man and the producer with the Emir of Bahrain in this private dinner. So I said, well, I'll take it because I've got a suit on. So I'd had a few gin and tonics by this time. I knocked on the door, and it was opened by a sort of flunky, and I said, I have to get a message to the pilot. He came in. And apparently I pushed a chair between Shirley and Stuart Morris and said to the waiter, you're not to leave until I've had my cream caramel. I must have been pretty gone. I was surprised I wasn't chucked out. But the people in there, they were all given Omega watches, which is a thing the Emir does.
Yes.
The soundman, I think it was the soundman, was a bit miffed because he only got a silver one. Until he came home and found it was platinum. But we had an amazing time, there. And on the flight back, well, Shirley was a lovely person, and we were all given some LPs on the flight out, as presents, and so we all lined up to get them signed. And Shirley noticed I'd taken my LP out. And she said, well, where's the record? I said, I'm not having you put your borrow marks all over my grooves. She still signed it. And on the way home, there was only enough seats for all of us in the plane. Shirley was lying on the floor on this sort of bed. Next door to her was the Grips, a man called Steve Phillips, who was great bloke, but he could get a bit narky sometimes, but he was all right on this one. These good Grips. And the hostess came around with some cheese sandwiches. And Shirley said, no, I don't want that. And Steve then said, come on, Shirl. He said, you need fattening up. And he got one and stuffed it in her mouth. And she said, for that, I will slap your face. And Steve said, not with that bleeding ring on, you don't. So she took it off and slapped him. She was good fun.
Yeah. She was mucking in.
Yeah,
sure.
Well, like many other people, everybody in BBC, we all had to go to a seminar called Extending Choice, where the idea was that you listen to some talks and then you go away with a facilitator and think of questions to ask the Board of Management. It was pretty awful. It was so bad I thought, I'll train to be a facilitator. So I did. And I took 13 Extending Choice sessions. And one of the things you had to do as a facilitator was to provide them with this glossy book called Extending Choice. And what everybody said without fail, what the hell, why are they spending money on this? They should be spending it on programmes. Perfectly reasonable. After the third one, I tried a different ploy. I only got one out, put it on the table and said, look, while you're writing your questions, have a look at this book. It's pretty expensive, but if you really want one, I'll try and get one for you. And they all wanted one. It was worth doing. We went on Warner Burke American facilitators courses and psychological thing. It was great. But at the end, we were invited by John Burt to a buffet for all the facilitators after Extending Choice finished. And it coincided with me winning second prize in the aerial caption competition, which was a picture of two men in white coats in the early days of radio, like the early days of radio sound effects. And I got second prize by saying it was the BBC management trying to define quality and distinction. I'd won a bottle of champagne, so I went up to collect it, and it's the same night as going to this buffet with John Burt. And when he all came round to talk to us, like Prince Charles sometimes, I told him this, and he was not amused at all. And the other time I was with John Burt was I had to light the radio theatre for a senior management conference. I got involved because I was in charge of the 4-camera multi-camera unit we had at Ealing. So I was there and I lit it in lovely pinks and magentas and things like that, all with little bubbly lights, because the side lights had that colour naturally. The director they hired was from Farming Today in Birmingham. Now, he was a lovely bloke, but he wasn't used to anything like this. And he came up to me and he said, oh, this is lovely, but we can't do it. We can't do this. And just when I was thinking, oh, well, I'm going to have to relight it, a member of the senior management came in and he said, oh, I say, this is jolly pretty. And the director said, we can do it. It was just like the producers. We were told when we finished lighting that he was coming round to inspect it. And I was told he would always object to something. So I rigged, I think it was a 2 or a 5K up in the balcony onto his lectern. I didn't need it, but I turned it on and he came in and looked, oh, I can't stand that. I said, oh, I thought I'd turn it off. He didn't complain about anything else. So, no, he wasn't my cup of tea. But in the end, he did me the favour, because the film department was closing down, and because I'd worked as I worked with you in BBC Smart and got to know the people from Panasonic and Sony, I was sent, possibly by you, to Birmingham to be a floating omnipresence in a trade show, so I could be an impartial BBC person with all the trade counsellors there for the BBC producers. That's what I was sent to do. And the only other person staying overnight was Neil Dunstan, who was the account manager for Sony. And because I was technically a customer, he said, well, I'll buy you dinner. So he bought me dinner. And while he was there, he said, I put your name forward for a job at Sony. I said, really? So I followed this up very clandestinely. And when it sounded hopeful, I went to see the manager at the film unit and said, I know there's no redundancies anymore, but is there any chance of early retirement? He said, oh, yeah, you can have one of those. I was just 50. So I managed to get early retirement and left the BBC on Halloween 1997. And 6 weeks later, I was on the staff at Sony.
Good. All right.
Fine.
I should get you a gin and tonic or
Yes.
something.
Yeah, that'd be great.